When I got to Argentina in 1976, I was a young kind of a backpacker journalist. I'd taken a leave of absence from a small weekly newspaper that I'd worked for in Colorado, and I was traveling around. And I got to Buenos Aires. I had my arrival was delayed because of the coup. I arrived about 6 weeks after the coup, military coup, and I liked it. I wasn't ready to keep traveling, so I decided to stay, and I got a job. I worked at United Press International, and I worked at the Buenos Aires Herald newspaper, which was a daily English language newspaper. And there I stayed until 1981, late in 1981. There certainly was a chance of people disappearing as a journalist. I always felt somewhat protected by my American passport. The few times that was, sometimes I was stopped. I remember being stopped in the street, coming back from a meeting one night, and my little car was surrounded by machine gun, carrying military people. And it was only until really I finally showed my passport, and I think that kind of saved my life at that time. It had nothing to do. I was at a meeting that it was nothing to do with related with my job at the Herald, but it was very frightening. And of course, our editor Robert Cox was arrested. Subsequently released, and then he did leave the country because of the threats against his family. And of course, Jacobo Timmerman of La Opinión. When I lived in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, there were only two newspapers that really covered what was happening in terms of the disappearances of the people and in terms of what the military was doing. That was La Opinión and the Buenos Aires Herald. And the Buenos Aires Herald was a small English language newspaper read mostly by expats in the British community. And La Opinión was a daily that was read by a lot of Argentine people. And when Jacobo Timmerman was arrested and tortured, and basically the newspaper shut down, so it was a real risk. But I was young, kind of naive, and I think I didn't realize exactly what the fear, what the repercussions could be. The odd thing about Argentina, and I don't really have a satisfactory answer for some of your questions, but was that life did continue as usual. It's sort of like when you're in a war. I'm sure if you were living in Iran, if it wasn't your brother who was taken, or your sister, or then you kind of go on your life as usual. At least that's what happened in Argentina. I mean, you were fearful if you saw a Ford Falcon, if you saw this unmarked car. If I was looking through my old notes and letters that I had written, and you would hear bombs going off a few blocks away sometimes. But if you weren't directly affected, I mean, Argentines kept going to the beach. They kept having their vacation. After a while, they could go. The schools were opened again, university. So a lot of people put blinders on, and I'm sure that happens all over the world in some horrible, like we know, Nazi Germany, for example. I mean, it's so Argentina. The Argentine people have a way of just kind of going on and keeping to their own business, and okay, they must have done something, and I'm going on with my life. I think a lot of people turned their eyes away from it because they didn't want to see it. It was very frightening. Also, I wasn't there before the military coup, but there were, a lot of people were very upset with the previous regime also. And there had been, bombings and a lot of attacks, and there was repression then too. From the current government. So I think a lot of people in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, and the whole country really said, oh, maybe let's give them a chance. Let's see if things calm down. And then when things happened, I think a lot of people they must have done something. That was a common, when people were killed and you would read about it the next day, you would hear about guerrilleros, terrorists. They must have done something, or the official reports were very different from what we heard from people who actually witnessed them. I remember getting, we, in those days, we had the news wires and Noticias Argentina, the official government would say, oh, 2 terrorists were killed in this gunfight out in some suburb. And the neighbors of them would call and say, that's not what happened at all. They were lined up against a building and shot. But yeah, I think it was only after the military left and other governments came in that some people began to either realize or chose to realize what had happened. So the people, what comes to mind immediately are the women and the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, which was the big plaza across from the Casa Rosada, the government house. And I interviewed, that was part of my job, to interview them when they would come into the Buenos Aires Herald. And they would at first they were just at wit's end and crying and what do we do, and the only thing we could really tell them was, we'll file a habeas corpus and maybe the government will tell you where they have them, and they would go from police station to police station and get no answers. So on April 30th, 1977, these women, a small group starting maybe 14, 16, met in the Plaza de Mayo, and that became a weekly occurrence, and they became famous lately, and some of them actually disappeared themselves and were killed. But that was one of the main protests. And I have to say that I think a lot of them were grandmothers. They were 60-something years old when they started doing this. Their grown children had been abducted, kidnapped, taken, and they never heard from them again. So that was probably the main protest. I mean, that we covered. And of course, the U.S. government sent down, when Jimmy Carter was elected, he sent down a human rights expert, Patricia Darien, who interviewed people in the government, but they were never forthcoming. The government was never responsive and never forthcoming about what had happened. But a lot of people fled the country. They rather than, I mean, it was very dangerous, and so there weren't the major protests, if you will, were these women wearing white kerchiefs walking around the plaza, most of them over 50, 60 years old. Something did happen to some of the mothers, and I think they at some point they would start taking them away to the police station. That happened to me one time when I went to cover a march. I was taken to the police station. I was released, but some of them were held, and so they decided after a time they stopped meeting there, and they met other places. They would meet in churches. But then eventually they resumed it. Why did the government not touch them? Maybe because they were so you could see, they were so visible. They were there. People could see them marching. What are they? I mean, they're not going to round up 100, a couple hundred at their biggest. They were, at that time in the 70s, there were probably 2,000. So I think the government in their Ford Falcons, or the unmarked Ford Falcons, would go around and take 2 or 3 people at a time, 1 or 2, and they were very clandestine. It was the middle of the night. These women were marching at 3:30 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon around the main square in Buenos Aires. The economic situation in Argentina has gone from bad to worse over the years, and today the inflation rate is well over 500%. At that time, it seemed to work for a while, and then no. I mean, that's one of the reasons I left Argentina, because it was becoming impossible with the day-to-day inflation. And no, it's I would say no, that they did not fix that at all. With so many military coups and Perón leaving and coming, I think people just took it. This is going to end like all the other regimes. I mean, Argentina is a very rich country in many ways, and it's sort of inscrutable, it's unfathomable how the governments have been one after another and not and never being able to really emerge as as a great country it should be. So I think people saw the military government as just yet another, that it was going to end eventually, just like the other ones had ended. And they're kind of cynical, actually. So I don't really have a great story about, oh yes, there's light at the end of the tunnel or anything. I think Argentines are pessimistic by nature. So they just have lived through this, and what, kind of what next. But I think the mothers tried never to lose hope. And as the outside world, the rest of the world became more aware of what was actually happening there, I think that the United States coming down and other people, I think they held on to hope that that people would realize that this was going to come to an end. The thing that interests me is my interest in Argentina when I was a journalist. There was the whole feminist movement, and I actually had a scholarship to write about the role of women in Argentina. And so I love it that, when I read about Iran, women are taking the lead as much as they possibly can in this. I hope for their sake that they get some freedoms. And I mean, it's horrifying what I read from abroad.